Hey everyone. So you wanted the whole picture on those Hawaii wildfires,
Yeah.
right? The ones that just ripped through Maui.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really wanted to understand what happened. And, you sent over a ton of material,
Yes, sir.
official reports, research studies, news articles, even some firsthand accounts. We're
Wow.
going to deep dive into all of it, try to figure out how this happened, what the lasting impact is going to be, and what we can all learn to prevent this kind of thing in the future.
You know what really gets me about this whole thing is it really kind of like challenges that picture-perfect image of Hawaii we all have in our heads.
Yeah.
8 volcanic islands, rainforests, this amazing mix of cultures.
Mm-hmm.
And, IS, beautiful.
It is?
But then you look at what happened to Lahaina, 81% of the city gone, just gone.
It's unbelievable.
This wasn't just any wildfire. It was the deadliest one in the U.S. in over a century.
Yeah, the scale of it is just, it's hard to even imagine over 100 people confirmed dead, billions of dollars in damage.
It's just,
Those numbers are staggering.
they are.
But I think what really hits home is the human element, right?
Oh, absolutely.
The Maui Police Department, the MPD, they actually included accounts from survivors and first responders in their report. And it's those stories that really put a face to the tragedy.
It's so easy to get caught up in the statistics.
Totally.
But behind every number is a life, a family, a whole story that's been completely upended. The MPD report really gives you just a glimpse of that.
Okay, so let's try to understand how this fire got so out of control so quickly. We know Hurricane Dora played a role, right? Even though it was hundreds of miles away from Hawaii.
Right, this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Dora didn't directly hit the islands, but it created this high-pressure zone above Hawaii.
Yeah.
And high pressure leads to strong winds, right? And they had incredibly strong winds, almost 100 kilometers an hour.
Wow.
It was those winds that took what could have been a pretty normal wildfire and turned it into something totally uncontrollable.
It's like the wind just fueled the flames, right? But there's more to it than that, isn't there? The Transient Catastrophe Research Report argues that the way land is used in Hawaii actually made the fire worse.
Yeah. For a long time, sugarcane plantations were a big part of Hawaii's economy.
Yeah.
But as those declined, invasive grasses started taking over.
Okay.
And these grasses are extremely flammable, way more so than the native plants. So it's like you had this massive dry landscape just waiting for a spark,
And sadly, Hurricane Dora kind of provided that spark.
in a way, with those
Um,
crazy winds.
Yeah. The Transre report is also pretty critical of the emergency response. They point to delays in getting water to the firefighters, power outages that knocked out the pumping stations, and even resources being wasted on buildings that were already gone instead of trying to contain the smaller fires.
Right.
Do you think, based on what you've read, that things could have been handled differently?
It's really hard to say for sure, hindsight's 2020. But the report definitely raises some important questions about how resources were allocated and whether a different approach could have maybe limited the damage.
Yeah, it's definitely something that deserves further investigation, especially when you think about what those first responders were dealing with on the ground. I mean, that MPD report, it's intense.
Yeah,
These officers were facing extreme heat, thick smoke down power lines. It sounds chaotic.
it was absolutely chaotic.
Yeah.
The report talks about how completely overwhelmed the 9/11 system was. And the officers were relying on radios that only had limited range in certain areas.
Oh, wow.
It really shows the communication challenges, in addition to all the physical dangers.
And on top of all that, they're trying to evacuate people, fight this massive fire, and then start the really difficult task of searching for those who didn't make it out.
It's unimaginable.
The report mentions local teams doing what they could and then specialized urban search and rescue teams coming in with dogs to help find remains.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine what that must have been like. It's incredibly difficult work, both physically and emotionally. You're seeing this level of destruction, you're searching for your friends and neighbors. I mean, the MPD report really just barely scratches the surface of the toll this took on the first responders.
And of course, it's not just the first responders. The whole community is dealing with the aftermath. We've talked about the immediate impact, but what about those long-term consequences? There's this study from the University of Hawaii Economic Research Organization, UHRO.
Right.
They surveyed hundreds of residents, mostly in Lahaina, to see how the fires have changed their lives.
And what's striking is how widespread the effects are, even months later.
Yeah.
The study found that 4 in 10 people were having trouble getting medical care or their medications.
4 in 10.
That's a huge jump from before the fires.
Wow, and it's not just healthcare. Food insecurity has become a major problem too, and some racial groups seem to be hit harder than others.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole mental health aspect, right? You're seeing increased rates of depression, anxiety, even suicidal thoughts. These are invisible scars that can take years to heal.
And then on top of everything else, there's this whole other layer of difficulty, the misinformation.
Oh, yeah.
The MPD report and Senator Hirono both talked about how bad it got after the fires.
It's a huge problem because misinformation can actually slow down recovery efforts.
Wow.
And it preys on people when they're already incredibly vulnerable.
Right.
We saw fake FEMA memos going around, rumors about lasers starting the fires, even lies about missing children.
It's hard to believe people would exploit a tragedy like that.
It is.
The MPD report actually included screenshots of some of these misleading social media posts.
It's scary how quickly it spreads.
It is. It really shows how technology can be used for good and bad. Like AI can be used to spread disinformation super fast, but it can also be used to detect and combat it.
Exactly. It's a double-edged sword.
So what can we do to make things better going forward? The MPD report had a lot of recommendations for how to prepare for future disasters.
They did. Some of them are very practical, like equipping police vehicles with tools to get into buildings faster, upgrading the communication systems,
Yeah.
and making sure first responders have better mental health support.
Yeah.
These are all things that could save lives in the future.
And it's not just about reacting to disasters when they happen, but trying to prevent them in the first place.
Right.
The report talked a lot about investing in things like controlled burns and better fuel management.
Absolutely. And on a larger scale, we can't ignore the role of climate change.
Right.
It's a major reason why we're seeing more wildfires, not just in Hawaii, but all over the world. Addressing climate change has to be a big part of the solution if we want to stop these tragedies from happening more often.
Okay, so in this first part of our deep dive, we've really tried to lay out how this idyllic image of Hawaii collided with the reality of what happened in Lahaina. We talked about how Hurricane Dora, the changes in land use, and all the challenges of the emergency response just combined to create this perfect storm.
And we've only just begun to explore the aftermath.
Yep.
A long road to recovery for the people of Maui. The inequalities in healthcare access and food security, the mental health toll, and this really disturbing issue of misinformation.
Yeah. When we come back, we'll dig deeper into some of these issues, and I'm really curious to explore those MPD recommendations. What really stood out to you as the most important points they made?
Well, there are a few that really jumped out at me. I think the need for better mental health support for first responders is absolutely critical, and the focus on community engagement,
Yeah.
preparing people for what to do if a disaster strikes, that's huge.
I agree. Okay, we'll be back in a minute to unpack all of that.
So diving back into those MPD recommendations, one that really hit me was their emphasis on those communication systems.
Oh, yeah.
During those first few chaotic hours, the 9/11 system was just overwhelmed completely.
Yeah.
People couldn't even get through. To make matters worse, the radio coverage was spotty in certain areas.
Makes sense. It's tough to coordinate any kind of response if you can't communicate.
Right.
What did they suggest to fix that?
Well, they recommended a multi-pronged approach. First, they said investing in better communication networks is crucial. Systems that can handle way more calls and data during an emergency without crashing.
Makes sense.
And then they also talked about exploring other ways to communicate. Think satellite phones or text-based systems that could work even when the cell towers are down.
That's smart, especially in a disaster where infrastructure can be totally wiped out.
Exactly.
But even with better communication, you still have the human element, right? The report also highlighted the need for more training, especially in something called Incident Command System Protocols, ICS.
Yeah.
What's that all about?
So ICS is basically a standardized way to manage emergencies. It gives a really clear chain of command and a shared framework for everyone who's involved in the response.
Okay.
It's about making sure everyone's on the same page and working together smoothly, which is so important in a crazy fast-moving situation like that.
So it's like having a plan in place ahead of time? So
Exactly.
you're not just reacting in the moment.
Exactly. Having that shared understanding and those clear roles can make a huge difference in how efficiently and effectively they use their resources.
Makes sense. And then there's the mental health aspect. We touched on this a bit earlier.
Yeah.
But the report really stressed the need to support first responders, not just physically, but emotionally too.
Yes, and this is something that's often overlooked. We tend to focus on the physical dangers,
Yeah.
but the emotional and psychological toll can be just as bad, if not worse.
Right.
I mean, think about it. They're seeing this horrible devastation, dealing with loss of life, making life or death decisions under incredible pressure. These experiences can leave lasting scars.
It's trauma, plain and simple.
It is.
And the report pointed out that the resources for dealing with that trauma were inadequate, both before and after the fires.
Right, and there's often a stigma associated with seeking help,
Right.
especially in professions that really value strength and resilience. But the MPD is calling for a real change in that. Encouraging people to talk openly about mental health and making it easier for officers to get the support they need. They even recommend something called paid daily wellness respite.
Paid daily wellness respite. What is that?
So it's basically dedicated time off, built into their schedule, where officers are encouraged to just step away from the demands of the job
Okay.
and focus on their well-being.
Yeah,
It could be anything from counseling to meditation to simply spending time with their loved ones.
that's nice.
It's a really proactive approach,
Yeah.
recognizing that these people need time and space to process what they've been through and to avoid burnout.
That's really interesting. It sounds like they're taking a much more holistic approach to supporting first responders.
Yeah.
But it's not just about the people on the front lines, right? What about the wider community? What role does the community play in all of this, in getting prepared for something like this?
The community's role is so important. The MPD report really stressed the need for more community engagement and education. People need to be aware of the risks and feel empowered to really take charge of their own safety.
So what would that look like in practice?
Well, they recommend things like creating more public awareness campaigns about the risks of wildfires.
Okay.
Teach people how to create those defensible spaces around their homes,
Right.
how to recognize the signs of a wildfire, and what steps to take if they need to evacuate.
So it's about educating people before a disaster happens.
Exactly. So they're better prepared to react.
Right. And they also talked about strengthening those partnerships between the police department and those community organizations, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
This could be anything from working with local groups to create neighborhood watch programs to conducting emergency drills and getting vital information out during a crisis.
Makes sense. It's about building those networks of support and communication before something bad happens, so everyone knows what to do and who to turn to for help.
Exactly.
Which brings us back to something we touched on earlier,
Yeah.
misinformation.
It's a big one.
The MPD report had a whole section on this,
Right.
even including examples of the kind of stuff that was spreading online.
It's crazy, right?
Yeah, it highlighted just how damaging misinformation can be, especially during a crisis. They mentioned fake FEMA memos,
Right.
rumors about lasers starting the fires, even attempts to discourage people from getting government aid.
It's awful.
It's hard to believe people would take advantage of a situation like that.
I know.
What did the report suggest doing about it?
Well, they recommended a multifaceted approach.
Okay.
First, it's really important to have one single trusted source of information.
Okay.
Maybe work with the local media community leaders, social media platforms to make sure accurate information is getting out to the
Keeping
public.
it through all the noise.
Exactly. Make sure people know where to go to get good information.
Right.
They also recommended giving people training to help them identify and really think critically about the information they see online.
That's so important, especially these days with everyone getting their news from social media and all these different places. You really have to be careful about what you believe.
Absolutely. It's about developing critical thinking skills, learning to question what you see and hear, and being able to tell fact from fiction,
Right.
especially during a crisis when people are emotional and it's easy to believe rumors and misinformation.
Okay, so even with the best preparations in place, disasters are still going to happen. That's just reality, right?
Yeah.
So what happens then? How do we move forward?
That's where those recovery efforts come in. And that's
Yeah.
where that U-Hero study we talked about before is so valuable. It gives us such important insight into the long-term impact of those fires and the challenges the community is up against.
So let's dig into those findings a bit more. What were some of the key takeaways?
Okay, one of the most concerning things was that huge increase in food insecurity. And remember, almost 38% of the Hispanic community said they were uninsured. So imagine the economic devastation from the fires on top of that. Many families are struggling just to put food on the table.
It's heartbreaking. And it's not just about food, right? It's about access to all those basic things. Medical care medications, mental health services. The U-Hero study found that a lot of people were facing huge obstacles in getting those essential services.
Absolutely. And those inequalities are especially bad when you look at different racial and ethnic groups.
Okay.
For example, Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. They're hit really hard by the fires, both in terms of property loss and health impacts. And yet they often face systemic barriers to getting resources and support.
So it's not a level playing field when it comes to recovering from a disaster like this?
No, it's not.
Yeah.
Certain communities are always hit harder and have fewer resources to help them bounce back.
And the You Your Hero study also found a strong link between being exposed to the wildfire and having health problems, right?
Yeah, people who were closer to the fires said they had more respiratory problems, cardiovascular issues, and even kidney problems.
Wildfire smoke is so dangerous.
It is.
It's full of all these harmful pollutants that can irritate your lungs, trigger asthma attacks, and even make existing heart problems worse.
Right, and we're really just starting to understand the long-term health effects of that kind of exposure. The early findings are definitely concerning.
And it's not just the physical health impacts we have to worry about. The mental health toll of something like this is huge.
It really is. The U Hero study found that rates of depression, anxiety, and PTSD have just skyrocketed since those fires. And it's understandable given everything they've been through.
Right.
Loss of loved ones, displacement from their homes, the constant reminders of the devastation.
It's a lot.
It is.
Yeah.
And yet access to mental health care is often very limited, especially in rural communities like Lahaina. The U Hero report really pushed for more mental health resources and making them easier to get for the people who need them.
And they also highlighted those community-based support networks, right?
Yes, those informal connections of family, friends, neighbors, even faith-based groups.
Yeah.
Those connections are essential. They provide emotional support, practical assistance, and a sense of belonging during a crisis.
Right.
It's about rebuilding those connections, nurturing a sense of community, and reminding people that they're not alone.
It's about helping people heal and get back on their feet. But there's also that economic side of things.
Oh, absolutely.
Those fires had a massive economic impact. Businesses were destroyed, jobs were lost, and tourism, which is such a huge part of the island's economy, took a major hit.
Yeah, and those long-term economic consequences are still playing out. It's going to take an enormous effort to rebuild Maui's economy. The U Hero study recommended a multi-pronged approach, focused on both short-term relief and long-term sustainable development.
What did they suggest specifically?
Well, they talked about the need for immediate financial help to get businesses up and running again, and for those job retraining programs to support the people who lost their jobs.
Okay.
They also emphasized diversifying Maui's economy, moving away from that heavy reliance on tourism and looking into other industries that can provide more stable jobs.
So create a more resilient economy.
Exactly, one that's not as vulnerable to these kinds of shocks.
Right. It's about building back better, learning from what happened, and making a stronger, more sustainable future for Maui.
Exactly.
But economic recovery is just one piece of the puzzle.
Right.
There's also that massive task of rebuilding homes, infrastructure, entire communities.
Oh, yeah.
Where do you even start with something like that?
It's a daunting challenge for sure. But the U Hero study really highlighted the need for collaboration when it comes to rebuilding, bringing together government agencies, nonprofit organizations, private developers, and most importantly, the community itself.
So it has to be a partnership
It does.
where everyone works together and the people who are most affected have a real voice in the process.
Exactly. And the report also recommended including climate-resilient design principles in that rebuilding process.
Okay.
Things like using fire-resistant building materials, creating those defensible spaces around homes, and maybe even rethinking how we plan cities to reduce the risk of wildfires.
So it's about learning from what happened and making sure those lessons are incorporated into how Maui is rebuilt.
It is. It's about creating communities that are stronger and more adaptable to the challenges of climate change. Communities that are better prepared for whatever might come next.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the immediate impact of the fires, the incredible efforts of the first responders, the ongoing struggles the community is facing, and the really complex and multi-layered recovery process.
We also looked at the MPD's recommendations for better disaster preparedness, from communication systems to mental health support to community engagement.
And we touched on how important it is to address climate change, which is the root cause of this increased wildfire risk,
Yeah,
not just in Hawaii, but around the world.
absolutely.
But it's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed by all of this. What can one person really do to make a difference?
That's a great question, and it's a perfect transition to what I want to talk about next. The power of individual action. Even small steps can make a big difference. But we'll dig into that more when we come back.
Welcome back. We've spent a lot of time really getting into those Hawaii wildfires, the long road to recovery, and all the lessons learned. But I think now is a good time to think about, what all of this means for you, the listener. Like, what can one person do to help in a situation like this? It's easy to feel kind of powerless when you see a disaster of this scale.
Yeah, that feeling of helplessness is definitely something a lot of people struggle with. But honestly, individual actions do matter.
They do.
It's those actions multiplied by millions of people that really create change.
So where do we start? What are some things people can actually do to help?
Well, the most immediate way to help is usually donations. There are a ton of really great organizations working in Maui, providing everything from food and shelter to medical care and mental health services. Even a small donation can make a difference in someone's life.
And what about people who can't donate money? Is there anything else they can do?
Oh, absolutely. Volunteering your time or skills can be super valuable. A lot of organizations rely heavily on volunteers for all sorts of things, from handing out supplies to providing counseling to actually rebuilding homes. Even if you could only give a few hours a week, it can make a real impact.
It's about finding a way to use whatever skills you have to offer.
Yeah,
And it's not just about the immediate aftermath either. Supporting those long-term recovery efforts is really important too.
that's where advocacy comes in.
Sure.
Reach out to your elected officials, let them know that these issues are important to you, and urge them to support policies that tackle climate change and support disaster preparedness and resilience.
It's about making your voice heard and holding those in power accountable.
Yeah,
And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is just spread awareness.
exactly.
Mhm.
Talk to your friends, family, colleagues about these issues. Share what you've learned from this deep dive into the Maui fires. Encourage them to check out the source material we talked about
Yeah.
and, just inspire them to get involved.
It's about creating that ripple effect,
Yeah.
amplifying the message and helping to build a collective movement for change. But it's not all about big actions, is it? What about those everyday choices we make? Can those make a difference too?
They totally can.
What?
Things like reducing your carbon footprint,
Mhm.
conserving water, supporting sustainable businesses, and making conscious decisions about what you buy. They might seem small, but when millions of people are doing them, it really adds up.
It's about changing our mindsets,
Yeah.
embracing a more sustainable way of life, and remembering that we're all connected to each other and to the planet.
And maybe the most important thing is to stay engaged. This isn't a one-time event. It's an ongoing process that needs our attention and action. Don't let those headlines fade from memory. Stay informed, stay involved, and keep pushing for a better future.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Hawaii wildfires, we want to leave you with a challenge. What will you do to make a difference? What actions will you take to help prevent these kinds of disasters, support communities impacted by climate change, and create a more resilient and sustainable world?
The choices we make today are going to shape the world tomorrow. Let's choose wisely.
Thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you found it informative, thought-provoking, and maybe even inspiring.